Hello. Okay, so we left off last session with this, where we can shoot a ray trace, sphere trace, and it will affect a character when it hits. I want to make, for one thing, the ray trace, is it called ray trace? In here. Yeah, sphere trace for objects. Ray casting is another word for it in a different game engine, but here it's sphere trace, specifically sphere trace for objects, or line trace depending on what you were trying to do. So this is where we are. I'm going to start by making the blast not as far away. The way I would do it is kind of adding like game limitations. And I'm going to change, so this is in the, back to the animation blueprint, AVB Michelle. I'm going to open that up, and then I have this here, in the event graph. This is where we left off, I believe. Yeah, with this stuff. Okay, so we have this actual blast stuff going on now, and I want to make the end distance not as far away. So this part right here is distance of blast. So what I did is I just right clicked the part, and at the bottom there's a node comment. So I'm going to make the blast distance more like, let's try 1500, 15. I need to turn on numlock, 1500, compile, let's see how distance that is. That's a decent distance, maybe even not that far. Maybe 1000. Okay, 1000. Yeah, that seems more realistic. More like limitations to a game rather than just being able to blast into infinity. Okay. So from here, we're going to make it so that actually when you play, you can also blast objects that are physical, which it cannot as of yet. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to be referencing my modified script as I show you this. So when we ended off of the blast part, we did the sphere trace, and it casted to the third person character, and it makes the character have physics, add impulse, and make it ragdoll. And before I add impulse, in the impulse input, this is a float amount that is adding impulse. So I'm going to right click the B float node, green node, and I'm going to promote that to a variable, and I'm just going to name that force amount for future reference, because we're going to be using that variable again when we apply it to an object instead. So hit actor goes to the hit actor third person character, but we're going to bring out hit component and make that affect other physical objects that are not the character. So over here, this is my setup that I have done. See here, I actually have a spawn an explosion end and spawn the projectile blast, but we're going to get to that after this. So we're using something called a sequence, which just means do this part first and then do the next part. So the sequence after blasting and hitting, it will cast to the third person character, do all that force stuff, and then the next one we will then add an impulse to the physical object. So for that, we're going to drag off from hit component, check to see if it's simulating physics. If that's true, as this is the condition, if this condition of simulating physics is true, then we're going to add impulse at location. And see here, I using that force amount variable and just multiplying it by 10, because for a physical object it's behaving slightly differently than hitting the character itself. So let's go back to our version that we have here. Okay, so let's see. So from the sphere trace for objects and the break hit result, we're going to drag off from hit component, because if the hit is true and the out hit is hit component, sorry, I just turned on my mouse visibility thing so you can see right click and left click and so on. Left click is red, right click is blue. Cool. Okay, so from hit component, we're going to drag off and type in is simulating physics. And that'll be because if the object is simulating physics, like these objects are, then we'll actually add force to them. Because they don't do anything right now, only the characters do. So, I'm going to click and drag this bottom so I have more space. So if collision is true, and that's called a branch, and if it's true, then add impulse at location. Add impulse. Okay, let's drag it from hit component, because it's the hit component's location. Add impulse. There we go. Add impulse. Okay. So that as well is dragged off from hit component, because that's where we're adding the impulse to. And for the impulse amount, let's drag in force amount here. Get force amount, that variable that we made from the force amount that's being applied to the character, the third person character. So let's drag that off and hit the multiply sign, which is Shift 8 for the star. The star is multiply in math. So let's make that a float times float. And then I'm going to make this 10 times. So now it's 10 times the force amount. Drag the green float into the yellow vector, and it will automatically transform it into a vector. Perfect. So that's done. Now, when we don't want it to go just to the third person character, I'm going to move these. We want it to also do this part. Okay. So drag off from true. If it hit is true, then if it's true, I'm going to type in sequence and click that. And like I said, it'll do this action first, then this action. So let's see what happens from that. Oh, hello. I clicked and dragged too much stuff. Just moving it so it's not completely spaghetti. Compile and save. And now let's see if that works, hopefully. Cool, it works. That might even be a little too much. Okay, well that works. Let's see. Well, we can go from there now that it does affect an object that is not the character.